This is really an opportunity for the citizens of Lowell to discuss and offer some feedback about what we think about the electoral system here in our city. And we're thankful for the city councilors who have come to listen and to hear that and receive that feedback and take it into the work that you do on the city council. I am Heather Doss. I'm the pastor at the Elliott Presbyterian Church, and I'll be your MC for tonight. I'll introduce our speakers and keep you apprised of what's happening. The agenda for tonight, we're not going to let you sit in those seats all night long. We're about to get you up and move you around into some small groups, and then we'll come back together for presentations and then break up into small groups again for some feedback at the end. All right, our first speaker tonight is Aurora Erickson. Aurora is a program director at Coalition for a Better Acre, and she's going to give a little bit of an introduction to how the voting system in Lowell works right now, and also take some questions about that. Our next presenter will be Oren Selstrom with the litigation director at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice, and he'll be able to speak more to the lawsuit itself. But Aurora's going to take a few minutes just to make sure we all have a sense of how things are working at present in Lowell. So welcome, Aurora.
So we thought, since we have a diverse group of folks in the room, we wanted to make sure that everybody got some really essential facts about how voting works. We didn't want to lose the opportunity to just say some really basic things. For those of you in the room for whom this is, I'm sure, a lot of review, just think about that there are folks in the city that don't know this, and think about how we can all work together to make this more accessible information. So I'm just going to talk for a little bit about kind of the essentials of how you vote in our city. So something that you might not think we would have to say, but lots of people do not know this. Only citizens can vote. To vote in Lowell, you have to have a Lowell address. And you don't automatically get to vote, you have to register to vote. And the form is pretty easy, but you need to fill it out again every time you move. And that's where we lose a lot of people. You do need to be a citizen. Most people know this, but just to have said it, that does include folks from Puerto Rico. Folks from Puerto Rico who are here absolutely can vote in our elections. So this is our registration form. You can get this form at City Hall. We have them here tonight if anybody needs to register, and the form is also available online. We have it here tonight in Khmer English and Spanish. So just a little bit about how the actual voting works if you haven't happened to do it yet. So you show up and you're going to check in with someone who looks like this gentleman in a red shirt over here. He's going to be friendly. He's going to find your name and your address on a list. And then you're going to go over to a little booth where people can't see what you're voting for, and you're going to fill out your ballot. Sorry for the wall of text. I didn't know the screen would be quite like this. I'm happy to make this available for anyone that would like it. And we also have piles of little voting FAQs that say everything that I'm saying right now, so feel free to take that paper form too. So where you vote should be in your neighborhood. There are polling places set up in the different neighborhoods, so it should be pretty close to where you live. When you show up, as I said, you check in at a front table. You have to give your name and address. You don't usually need an ID, but they say it's a good idea to bring one in case there's a little bit of confusion on your form, in case you missed a line. It's a good idea to have your driver's license or your passport or a utility bill. They give you a ballot, and you take the ballot to a little booth. No one can see what you're doing, and in that booth you fill in the little bubbles to show who you want to vote for. You put the ballot in a machine, and you check out before you go. So once again, this is our ballot, and hopefully this is familiar to most of you. This is another place where we see a lot of confusion. You fill in the bubbles next to your choice. You have to make sure you fill in the little oval all the way. And you want to make sure you follow the instructions and don't vote for too many. You also don't have to vote in all of the different sections. If there's only one candidate you want to vote for, that's totally fine. If there's only one race you want to vote for, that's totally fine. So this is our ballot from last time around for City Council. A couple of rights that we want to make sure everybody knows that they have. If you need help, you can take someone with you into the voting booth, whether that's help with language or whether it's an access issue for you. You also have the right to an absentee ballot, so you can vote by mail. And that's for folks who have like a health issue that keeps them from being able to go out to the polls, or for people who are going to be out of town that day. And you just have to fill out the form either at City Hall or online in advance. You can't do that day of, that's important to know, you have to do it in advance. You can also take in a paper to remind you of who you want to vote for, that's totally okay. You just can't leave the paper in there. So it's totally fine to bring in a little filled out form, and that's especially important for people who may not have a ballot in their language. They can have the paper form that'll help them fill in the right bubbles. Fortunately, our Lowell ballots are now available in Spanish and Khmer, which is very exciting. And we do want people to know that if they have a problem with voting, if someone at a polling place tells you something different than any of this, please give us a call at CVA. Once again, this number is on all those little pieces of paper, so please feel free to grab one if you think you might need it. We're happy to help with any confusion or any issues that pop up. Everybody gets from the city a census form that's for just the city census. And if you don't fill it out, you can be taken off the active voter rolls. So that is something that can be very confusing for people to get in the mail. It's kind of a complicated thing to try to explain in a short little postcard, and I think lots of people don't, like you said, think it's junk mail or don't recognize what it's trying to tell them, which is that if they don't fill it out and return it, they might be taken off the voter rolls. Yeah, the election office is always open to trying to work on issues. They have a massive task every time there's an election. They have to educate a ton of poll workers very fast. And of course, there's a lot of complex rules. So confusion is going to happen. I think overall the election office works really hard to try to make it as easy as possible for people.
So recently, we've had the opportunity to vote ahead of time, not just for an absentee ballot, but to vote several weeks ahead of time. So is that available for every election or only some elections?
I don't think we have the budget to do it for city elections, so this last election we did not have early voting. Early voting is something that I think it's easy to guess why that might make it easier for people to vote. I think you can also see why it might be challenging for an election office to provide it, because it does mean that they have to staff a number of additional days. But I think we had great numbers for our early voting in the 2016 election, and I think it's something that they're excited to continue. I think they would probably, I don't know this for sure, so don't quote me, but I think the reason why we don't have it in city council elections is probably a resources issue, and I think if that was something that was important, that might be something we could ask for as a community.
I just want to raise that a lot of Cambodian voters used to vote. They don't read the name. They can't read English. In Cambodia, all the candidate has pictures of their picture of the candidate next to the name. So people from Cambodia who cannot read English, they identify by the pictures. Is that a way we can petition the Secretary of State to make the ballot with the picture of the candidate's name for the people who can't read English?
I think that would be a bigger deal because we'd have to get permission from the state, but I think if it's something people wanted to push for, it's easy to see why it might be a great thing to do.
The significance of voting is certainly to go out and vote and exercise your right, but secondly, there's a state law that requires or allows communities every 4 years or every 2 election cycles to go through the list and see if you did not vote, then they will remove you from the list. So it's important to return the census. It's equally important to go out and vote, because that tells the election commission that you still live here, or you're still alive, or you're still interested in voting. Otherwise, they will purge those individuals that didn't. And I believe it was around 8,000 registered voters that were taken off the voting rolls just recently. So I just want to make that it's very important to vote for two reasons. One, to exercise your right, but second, to make sure you can say, and you can go and register to vote. It's easier to register to vote now, so if you think that you didn't when you go, if you're not on some voting rolls and you get a new license, just sign up again, because it's that easy and that important.
The reason why they would do that is because if a person moves or if a person passes on, all of that can add up to a lot of confusion in the voter rolls and sort of like extra potentially chaos causing people that aren't actually active voters. So they do need to kind of keep the list active, and that's the reason why they would do that purge. The issue can be if there's someone that's not a very active voter but then does want to turn out to vote for a particular election, they might find that they're not on the rolls. So it's a difficult balance for them to strike.
So next is Oren Selstrom. As I said, Oren is the litigation director for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice. It's a nonprofit organization that is supporting the plaintiffs in the lawsuit that has been brought against the city of Lowell on the Voting Rights Act. I'll turn it over to Oren. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. Can you hear me with the microphone? That works. As the pastor said, my name is Oren Selstrom. I'm with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice. We're a nonprofit civil rights organization that is based in Boston. We work on issues of racial justice and immigrant justice, so cases involving employment discrimination, housing discrimination, police misconduct, for example, and the issue we're here to talk about tonight, voting rights. Together with my co-counsel from Ropes & Gray, and I see Scott is here tonight, our pro bono co-counsel from the law firm of Ropes & Gray, we are privileged to be representing 12 members of the Lowell community who have come together to file a voting rights lawsuit to change the way that Lowell elects its city council and school committee, alleging that the current system violates federal voting rights law. It's one of the most important and exciting cases in voting rights going on in the country right now, believed to be the first of its kind to bring together the Asian and Latino communities together to enforce the federal voting rights law. I want to talk a little bit about the laws that we enforce and then specifically about the lawsuit and the status of the lawsuit. The primary voting rights law that we enforce at the Lawyers Committee is the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is a law that was passed at the height of the civil rights movement, primarily coming out of voter suppression activities that were going on in the South against African American voters. It's an extremely powerful law and has been used since then to enforce voting rights for a broad range of communities of color across the United States and has really dramatically changed the voting rights landscape over the last 50 or so years. The basic principle behind the Voting Rights Act is equal voting opportunity. The idea that everyone's vote should count equally and that there should not be unnecessary barriers to voting opportunity. And so the Voting Rights Act strikes down very concrete provisions that may stand in the way of voting. For example, poll taxes used to be in place where people would have to pay in order to vote. That is something that's not allowed under the Voting Rights Act. Literacy tests, where there would be a test to see whether someone could read and write in order to allow them to vote. That has been struck down under the Federal Voting Rights Act. But the law also does something different, which is to allow challenges to what's called vote dilution. So these are barriers that exist, processes that exist that are maybe not as concrete as something like the poll tax, but that nonetheless have the impact of diluting the vote for communities of color. And the Federal Voting Rights Act allows that kind of challenge as well. The power behind the Voting Rights Act, of course, comes from the fact that a court can order change. that often when you're talking about electoral systems that are being challenged, the people in power may not want to change the system voluntarily. And that is why the federal courts often have to step in to enforce the voting rights law and insist that a change happen when otherwise the votes of communities of color would be impermissibly diluted. So I've talked a little bit about vote dilution, and I want to talk in specific about how vote dilution occurs for at-large electoral systems, because this is one of the main practices that has been struck down by many federal courts around the country as diluting the right to vote. In an at-large electoral system, all candidates run citywide. So for example, if you have 9 city council members, all of them run and are elected citywide. This can be contrasted with district elections. So for example, if you have a city that has 9 councilors, instead of having everyone run citywide, you can have district-based elections where the city is broken up into 9 different districts or neighborhoods, and people from that neighborhood vote for their representative to send to the city council. The problem with at-large electoral systems, as courts have often found, is that they have the tendency to dilute the vote of communities of color. Essentially what happens if you have a system where there is a majority that tends to vote the same way and tends to vote in a way that's different from the candidates that communities of color want to elect, that can have the effect of diluting the vote of the communities of color in a way that 51% of the electorate can essentially end up winning every seat in every election and control 100% of the seats. And that is what courts have found is fundamentally unfair about at-large electoral systems when they work in that way. That's sometimes a hard concept for people to get their minds around because we're used to thinking of majority rule as being something that is fair, but it's not always. And you can see that the best example I've heard is an analogy to a family that is trying to decide on movie night for their kids for a year. The idea that every Saturday night the family's going to watch a movie, and you've got 5 kids, 3 of whom love Star Wars movies, 2 of whom love Disney movies. What would you do if you were in that situation trying to figure out how to structure a movie night every Saturday night for a year? If you're a parent, you're probably going to come up with some system that switches back and forth. It says we're going to watch 3 weeks, we're going to watch Star Wars movies, then we're going to go 2 weeks Disney movies. 3 weeks Star Wars, 2 weeks Disney. Something where you move back and forth. But what you're probably not going to do is to say we're going to vote every weekend night, and whoever wins the most votes, we're going to watch that movie. Because what you would end up with would be every week the 3 Star Wars fans would outvote the 2 Disney fans, and you'd have 52 weeks of Star Wars movies. That's not fair. And I think anybody with kids knows that you're going to get a reaction to that. The 2 who are being outvoted every time are going to say, that's not fair, I don't have a voice in this family. And that's essentially what happens in at-large voting when the majority is able to dilute the vote of the minority in every single election. So that is essentially what our lawsuit alleges is happening right now in Lowell. Lowell does have an at-large electoral system for all 9 city council seats, for all 5 school committee seats. And you can imagine, for example, that Lowell could be split up into districts with a neighborhood centered around the Acre, for example, that elected the member of the city council that was going to represent that neighborhood. That's how most cities in Massachusetts have some form of local government that looks like that, but Lowell, alone among large cities, has a system where it's all at large. And what we also know is that the majority white population in Lowell tends to vote in ways that are different from communities of color, and so are basically allowed to win every election in every time, just like the movie night example. This is a very quick bar graph that shows Lowell's changing demographics over time, something that all of you are familiar with, that Lowell is becoming increasingly diverse and now is just on the cusp of being a majority-minority city with 49% communities of color, predominantly Latino and Asian American, and also African as well. This is another representation of that same diversity showing from the most recent census in 2015. Again, the fact that Lowell is just on the cusp of becoming a majority-minority city. What you see here is a contrast to, on the left-hand side, the diversity of Lowell, and on the right-hand side, a pictorial of the diversity, or lack thereof, of school committee and city council members from 2007 to 2015. So you can see the huge imbalance that exists there. Those numbers have changed just slightly in the 2017 election with Vesna Noon's election, so you would see 3 point something there on the right, but just slightly with the imbalance still remaining there. For the school population, the numbers are even more stark in that the student body of the Lowell Public Schools is even more diverse than the city as a whole, as you see in this pie chart. And yet, there's the representation from the school committee in terms of candidates or officials of color from 2007 to 2015. Again, this has changed slightly with the recent election of Dominic Lay, so you would see a tiny little sliver there in the pie chart on the right if these numbers were updated, but the huge imbalance that exists would still be there. The question comes up about why is this important, and I think that's something that people have many different answers to. But for many people, it comes down to the importance of diversity in Lowell, the fact that people pride the fact that Lowell is a diverse community and want to see that reflected in their public officials, want to see that reflected in elected bodies in a way that it doesn't. People feel that's important for their children to be able to see that there are those pathways to power that exist, that are visible, that you can go on to be in positions of power, and that does not currently have that kind of reflection in Lowell. It also has very concrete ramifications when there is an elected body that does not reflect the diversity of the community that it purports to represent. I thought the icebreaker was a very good way of getting at that question in terms of who do you turn to when there's something in your neighborhood that you may see that you want changed. If you want to make sure that your children have access to parks, for example, or that issues that are important to you, whether they're translation services being available, or sidewalks being repaired, how can you get access to your local officials? And study after study have shown that when a city council is reflective of the diversity of the city that it represents, you are much more likely to get that kind of responsiveness in a way that doesn't exist when you have the kind of disparity that you see reflected in these charts here. The lawsuit we filed was filed in about a year ago, in 2017 in May, and several of the plaintiffs are actually here. I don't know if people want to raise their hands and identify themselves, but it's 12 individuals who have stood up to say this is a system that needs to be changed. The city tried to get the case dismissed in last fall, saying that it was improper for the Asian and Latino communities to come together to bring a voting rights challenge. The federal judge hearing the case dismissed that argument, threw that out, and so we are proceeding on with the lawsuit and hoping to go forward to trial in early 2019. So hopefully we can have a change to the electoral system by the time of the next local elections. I wanted to end with an example from Springfield to show that change can happen. My organization brought a very similar voting rights lawsuit in 2005 against Springfield, which at the time looked very similar to Lowell in terms of a solely at-large system. and a city council and school committee that was virtually all white. We went to court, and the city in that case actually settled before we went to trial. And today, the city council and school committee are among the most diverse in the Commonwealth because they changed away from the strictly at-large electoral system that Lowell currently has. We've approached the city here about the possibility of voluntary change, most recently in February of this year, but have not heard a response back since then. So we're proceeding on with the litigation and fully expect that when we get to trial, we will prevail. The facts are very strong, the law is on our side, and we're excited to have the group of plaintiffs that we have and the supportive community that we have to help us press forward. So that's an overview of what the voting rights law is and what our lawsuit is all about, and I'm happy to take questions.
Since this is a federal law, you would think that there would be some sort of federal law enforcement agency that would be taking care of the enforcement of the law. Instead, it's, if I understand you correctly, you're a civilian organization. You don't have anything to do with the federal government, as far as I understand. And so, why is there no federal enforcement of the federal government's own law?
We're not affiliated with the government. We're a nonprofit organization. We're fortunate enough to have the pro bono resources of Ropes and Gray, which is a law firm that is donating its time and its services to this lawsuit, because we don't have the resources, certainly, of the federal government. There have been certainly other federal administrations where we've seen greater voting rights enforcement than the current one. So certainly back in the 1960s and 1970s, the federal Department of Justice was quite active in voting rights litigation. The Trump administration, not so much. That's where the Lawyers Committee, my organization, is able to step in and fill that gap. The fact of the matter is, it's not happening the way it should be happening at the federal level, but the law does allow private parties to come into that space, fill that gap, and enforce the law the way we're doing in Lowell.
So that's what I'm saying. If it's a federal situation, why doesn't it get resolved as easily as giving us our rights?
Their rights. I mean, that's always been the way it's been with civil rights. And that's why I'm so proud of the plaintiffs that we have, that we're representing, people that have said, this is important, this is not going to change. I'm not going to sit around and wait for the government to change for me. I'm going to do what the law allows me to do, which is to file suit and get this presented before a federal judge. Because I couldn't agree with you more. We need that kind of enforcement, and that's what we're seeking to do with this lawsuit.
How many more election cycles are we likely to go through before this suit is settled? The other thing I wanted to say was, as a new resident of Lowell, one of the reasons I moved here was the diversity that I saw when I was walking around the streets. And then I went to my first city council meeting, and there was obviously some kind of a problem. Some kind of a problem with the democracy. When issues like this come up, it's usually not just a structural problem, it's indicative of a wider social problem. During the recent city council campaign, as I recall, most of the candidates, when questioned, said that they were in favor of citywide, at-large elections, and I think only a couple said they agreed with the lawsuit. So that would say to me that there's a wider sentiment at play here in the city of Lowell as a whole, that wants to maintain the current arrangement. So can you comment about that?
These things can be unpredictable, so we are not sure when we're going to get a trial date. There hasn't been one set yet, but we have consistently said both to the city and to the judge who's hearing the case that we want to move forward as quickly as possible, hopefully to have a change in place by the November 2019 elections. And so that is our hope and our expectation that we will keep moving forward as aggressively as possible in order to do that. Your second question had to do with sort of change coming from within in some respects. And I think that is really one of the reasons why the Federal Voting Rights Act is so powerful, is because that kind of voluntary change has to come from elected officials who got to their positions through the electoral system that they would then be dismantling. And so it is very hard often for elected officials who benefited essentially from the electoral system that got them into office to turn around and change that. And that is why, in many cases, the only way that change happens is through a federal judge ordering it. Because the problem that you've pointed out is something that's endemic in these kinds of situations where the people who have the power to change it got in power because of the system that is being asked to be dismantled.
The discussions that, well, all the discussions that are taking place in executive session, so none of us know what the city's thinking. I have a quick question. Is the city hiring an outside law firm for this, or are they doing it through the city solicitor's office?
We have seen a notice of appearance from an individual who I believe works at a private firm, but whether or not what the arrangement is with the city on that, I don't know. And whether or not taxpayer dollars are going to support the defense of the lawsuit is, again, a question to ask your elected officials.
Right, but the problem is they're doing all this in executive session, which they have the right to do, and we'll never know anything until the whole case is completed. That's when the minutes are going to be released, so we're going to be in the dark. The only way we're going to know anything is through you, not through them, unfortunately.
Well, that's that's a good point, that there are discussions that may be going on in executive session. Certainly anything that's public, we are committed to making sure that the community is aware of to the extent that we know it. And there are certain things in the course of litigation that have to be public. If, for example, there are payments being made to an outside law firm, that's something that the press and others could get a hold of and know about. But you're right that there's a certain amount that may take place behind closed doors, and citizens can press their elected officials to respond, but that may or may not be forthcoming.
Aaron, I just want to ask you if in preparing for the litigation you're going to include a good deal of storytelling. The plaintiffs, some of whom I know, are a wonderful source, but there's also the community as a whole. And one of the reasons I'm asking you this, because I think it's very important to recognize and empower every community that lives in Lowell. And they have some extraordinary stories to tell. I personally have heard a lot of stories that people feel disenfranchised. And for example, when I suggest, why don't you meet your representative or whatever, there is a nervousness, there's a feeling that they will not be received, that they will not be understood. I've just personally had an experience. I'm trying to encourage parents to go and talk about the education of their kids much more. After a lot of effort, a family went and were treated with complete disrespect because it's not regarded as normal for Khmer or Hispanic parents to go and talk to the school with issues. And when they do, the schools don't like it. And I think if we had a changed city council and a changed school committee, it would make a difference. But I think as part of building your case, I would really strongly encourage you to collect some of the extraordinary stories that are very, very easy to find and extremely rich. And in collecting them, it would in itself empower that constituency.
So there's certain legal requirements that have to be met to prove a Voting Rights Act violation, but then there's a number of other factors that the court can consider to see whether or not essentially people's representation is being harmed in just the ways that you are raising. How exactly to capture that and place it before the judge is something that we are going to be considering and are considering to work on. But I think that idea really gets at the heart of what the Voting Rights Act is all about, which is not just the numbers and the disparities that I showed you in the slides, but the meaning, the real harm that it does to individuals who can't get access to their city government in that way, and how to capture that best and paint it for the federal judge is something that we're definitely looking at.
So Oren is hopeful that this lawsuit has strong legs and will prevail, hopefully with the cooperation of the city instead of with the city fighting it. What would be ideal, right? Save money for the taxpayers. But what would it look like if Lowell changed our voting system? And that's what Felicia Sullivan is going to talk about next. Felicia has more than 10 years of experience working both professionally and personally in elections and voter engagement. Thank you.
So I want to preface this by saying that I'm going to talk about districting as a concept and as a process, and I'm going to show you some examples using Lowell as the base. But what I'm showing you here is in no way any kind of districts that have been drawn by anybody other than myself as just an example. So I think people get really excited about these things and then say, this is what's going to happen. This is not what is happening. I'm just giving this as an example. So that caveat is there. Also, if the lawsuit is successful, the courts will basically say to Lowell, like, come up with a solution to this problem. There are many solutions. Creating voting districts is one solution. There could be other solutions that would meet the same criteria of giving more political voice to the Asian and Latino populations here in Lowell. But districts are a very common one, and it's one that's very common in other cities. As Oren said, Springfield, also Boston, most other large cities have some form of districts. So, a political district. This is a picture of Lowell broken up into its wards and precincts. There are many kinds of political districts. Wards and precincts are one way to organize things around sort of figuring out where you're going to vote. Congressional districts are another kind of district. So what we're talking about here would be some kind of political district where the city would be sectioned off into reasonably noticeable chunks of maybe 8 or 9, maybe 7, 8 or 9 districts that would give various parts of the city more representation on the city council. These are Lowell's neighborhoods, a slightly different map than I think the one that's in the room there, depending on who you talk to. Neighborhoods are sort of amorphous things. This comes from the, I think this is a map that came from the city perhaps. Sometimes it gets broken out, South Lowell, sometimes broken out into South Sacred Heart and South Lowell. Sometimes you have Lower Belvedere. Sometimes the Highlands is Highlands and Lower Highlands. So neighborhoods are not political boundaries right now. They're sort of social boundaries or community boundaries. So one way people might think about districts are somehow conforming political voting districts with neighborhoods. So right now, this is a slightly different version of Lowell. This is where the representatives from 2011 to 2015 resided. And as Oren said, this has shifted a little bit with the 2017 map. But as you can see, there's a huge cluster of our representatives that are traditionally come from Belvedere, a little bit of a chunk in Pawtucketville, another few in the Highlands, very, very few from sort of Centerville or the center part of the city. And it wouldn't surprise you to know that the largest sort of voting bloc in local elections comes from the area that has the largest number of political representatives. So, people will vote for the people they know. That's how it works. So if more people voted in other parts of the city, there might be slightly different political representation, but it's hard. This is, so the parties to the lawsuit are the Asian and Latino community members. The darker, these are census blocks. Blocks are just a census designation saying where population lives. So the darker the block, the higher the concentration of Latinos and Asians combined. So as you can see, the center part of the city has the place where the largest group of folks who are party to the lawsuit reside. And as you saw from the map before, that's not where the political representation of people live. That's not to say that folks who live in those other areas couldn't represent the issues of the folks who live in different parts of the city. That's sort of the idea behind an at-large. But the thing is sometimes, I live in the downtown. The downtown, lots of people have a lot of things to say about what the downtown should or shouldn't be. I live there, I've lived there for almost 20 years. I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of what it is to be a resident there, which is different than running a business there. So that's sort of where we are. So what would districts do? So one thing that districts would do would be to carve up the city in a way where you would take equal amounts of population and say, let's draw boundaries in different parts of the city so that we can get people from different parts of the city elected to both the city council and school committee. So this is a really hard map to see, but you can see this is just an example of how one set of districts might be drawn. And this is kind of conforming a little bit to neighborhoods. You can see some green boundary, which is sort of Upper Highlands. There's a little orange boundary. Again, like, this is really hard to see. The Acre has like a little bit of a line. Pawtucketville. This is kind of one example, and I'm sorry if you can't really see the lines very clearly. I probably should have made the colors a little more distinctive. Like Aurora, I think I was thinking it was going to be a slightly bigger screen. But the important thing is if we were to take the population dynamics underneath these boundaries of these districts, and this is sort of using a tool that's very commonly used in districting, mapping program, we would basically get, this is the percentage of Asian and Latinos in each of those. I used 8 districts as an example. It could have been 7, it could have been 9, but I used 8. So you could see those mythical districts 1 and 2 would get well over 50% of the population being Asian and Latino. So we could definitely have 2 districts that more than represented the plaintiff communities. And then, lower populations in the other districts that were drawn. So that's the percentage of population. But here's the actual numbers that underlie it. So this actually, while it met the criteria of having 2 districts, or at least 1 district that would be representing the plaintiff communities, it actually doesn't meet the other criteria that the district should have fairly equal population amongst them. So you see there's very uneven population numbers here. So even if you can't read the numbers, you can just see that a couple of the districts have very low population, some are higher. The goal is to get them as even as possible. So this district plan here, this would not succeed because it wouldn't provide one of the criteria to kind of like equally populationed districts. It would succeed on the 2 districts that have a high percentage of Latinos and Asians, but it wouldn't succeed in having fairly evenly distributed population. So that wouldn't succeed as a district. Okay, so I'm going to try again. So I draw another set of districts. It looks kind of the same. I kind of expanded out Sacred Heart a little more into South Lowell, kind of expanded the downtown over into Centerville, kind of squished the Upper Highlands a little bit further back and made more room in the Lower Highlands. So this too. So example 1, if you can see the boundaries, you can barely see the difference. And again, my lines are really horrible because I didn't choose the right colors. And this one too did a little bit better at trying to even out the population. It's still not good. Those last 2 districts are still a little bit too low, so they need to be kind of bumped up a bit, but it's a little more even. So we're getting there. And we still have 2 districts that are pretty good in terms of high percentage of Asians and Latinos. So basically, this is still also not good yet. So if we were part of a group that had been commissioned by the city, said, okay, the lawsuit's gone through, we're going to create a committee of people interested, committed, appointed people to talk about this. That might be one way they do it. It might be a subcommittee of the city council. It might be a combination of plaintiffs and city council. It could be any kind of way. There would probably be multiple iterations of an exercise like this. Of like, let's see where we could draw boundaries that seem reasonable, fairly compact, not crazy, where we have, I suppose we could draw a district that just outlines the city, but that wouldn't really be that great. Compact, still met the criteria of creating 1 or 2 opportunity districts for the plaintiffs with high enough percentages, but then also were fairly equal number of population. And I can tell you, just me trying to do this with my inexpert ability, because I can do mapping and districting, but I'm not very, it took me a long time just to come up with these 2 examples. So an expert who would be hired to kind of come up with some versions would do it quicker. But these are the sorts of things you would be, if you were being informed citizens, trying to think about they're going to put districts in, those are the things you'd be looking for. Are the districts fairly compact and they kind of look like something, like a neighborhood perhaps, or close to a neighborhood boundary? Do they have fairly equal population across each of the proposed districts? And do the plaintiff communities have the opportunity to control, be the minority controlling interest in at least one, possibly two, of those new districts? So those are the things to be looking for if the decision, if we're successful with the lawsuit, and the decision is to go with a districting kind of format, those are the kinds of things to be looking for. So I think the idea was just to give you a little bit of an overview, and I'm sorry my boundaries were very hard to look at and see with this setup. But that's sort of the idea.
We have some questions. We want to make sure our facilitators take notes at this time, because we do want to report these things back out. And these are things we can, some of the questions in the small group discussion are things that might be relevant to our city councilors and to others who are in the decision-making process. So
I think another big point was reaching out to our communities and making sure that we're getting our votes in so that we advocate for ourselves.
We talked about how in some neighborhoods a lot of the polling locations have changed over the year and it's really confusing. Sometimes the census information is confusing, but also seems like for some people they are confused why certain questions are even being asked. Sometimes people get treated poorly when they show up and they, what's your district? Well, I don't know my district. Can I tell you what my address is? And you can help me figure it out. Let's see, other concerns, sometimes candidates don't always cover the entire city when they're doing their outreach. There isn't proper signage around the whole city to talk about elections when they're happening. And so we talked about a lot of positive things that some nonprofits have done to provide opportunities for residents to meet the candidates. Let's see. And we talked a lot about how feeling comfortable engaging in a system that doesn't represent you, or feels like it doesn't represent you, takes a lot of time. Both you have to feel like your own community has buy-in and you feel empowered by your own community, but also that it shouldn't fall on communities of color or marginalized communities to do all of that activism work, to show up and say we want to change the system, that the white allies need to show up as well and support them, especially when there has been historic issues around showing up and advocating for everyone's.
any action items do you want to report out?
Yes, action items were largely around engaging, building community relationships, going door to door, speaking to city council about your opinions, lobbying them if you want the suit settled. We talked about how potentially it's only 3 out of 9 people who on the city council who want to settle, and the rest want to put it to a ballot initiative. That's right.
We had a really great conversation, and we believe that there should be much stronger communication between all the working nonprofits and organizations. Particularly a lot of pressure for the community to the CMAA.
Yeah.
But yes, I think it's definitely an important effort that we should put more energy towards. There have been problems with voting location changes. I think that was an issue that was brought up in the previous group as well. Some of these folks have been asked to check their IDs, which is a huge issue because they didn't realize that it was an issue to get your IDs checked. They want to understand the system more. They don't understand why every 2 years you get off the voting list if you don't get voted, if you don't vote, and why there's so many underlying systems in place to make sure that voting doesn't take place for people that don't understand the English language as a first language. They do like the district representation. They think that it's great to be able to vote for someone to represent your neighborhood. That's a strong outcome that they would love to see. And they also get frustrated that candidates only come around when it's voting time, and that when they want come get their votes, they show their faces then. So, am I missing anything else, too?
That's it. I think that after election should be, you don't see them anymore, and that's not good.
So I guess for tonight, let's just say if you want to know how you can do more or you're ready to do more, speak with Aurora or myself or Nancy or Mary or Felicia, and any of them would be happy to figure out what is right for you and the right way to get you involved in a way that feels comfortable and appropriate for you.